Hello there, everyone. This is Madhog, and I'm considering this additional recording as a sort of companion piece to my Higurashi unscripted ramble video / podcast, but also a possible beginning of a new journey, because I have decided at long last to finally read for myself the classic Higurashi sound novel, and I have a few opinions to share in that regard. I am mostly interested in analyzing Higurashi from the point of view of its aesthetic presentation in regards to its setting, because there are several versions of Higurashi out there by this point. I remind you that the first chapter of Higurashi dates back to 2002. So, of course, the entire Higurashi series was remade several times for console releases: PlayStation 2, PlayStation Portable, PlayStation Vita, PlayStation 3, and so on and so forth. There was even a Nintendo DS version of it. Of course, none of those are widely available legally in the West. As of this recording, there are two major versions of Higurashi that are easily available for everyone to get, and generally speaking, they are the two versions that people recommend. One would be the Steam version. The Steam version has the classic vanilla, mostly untouched edition, the purest and most authentic Higurashi experience one could have, as long as you toggle off the newer sprites and you just play it with the original sprites, because the newer ones are ghastly, especially when you put them atop the classic photographic backgrounds featured in the novel. They look bad in that, and they're also significantly smaller and tinier than the original, much more charming sprites. So, of course, if I would have to recommend a way to play this, and if you want the original feeling of Higurashi, that is the way to play it. However, we also have available, outside of Steam, ask your local library, the PlayStation 3 version, which includes not just the chapters that are already available on Steam, but also the remaining arcs that were made exclusively for console releases. And it has pretty much everything, the complete experience for the completionist. Of course, it being a more recent edition, it is a lot more polished in the art direction and audio department. We are talking about full voice acting, completely redrawn backgrounds, recomposed music, newer art and CGs. Everything is a lot more polished. And that's definitely one way to experience this. And both ways to experience Higurashi, I would say, have their own raison d'être, if you will, their own reason of being. And I would definitely not be the kind of person who says one way to experience it is better than the next. It's just that Higurashi is that kind of timeless, universally appealing narrative overall that can be redressed in many and all ways, and its inherent meaning will not lose out in either way. However, and this is where my own opinion in the matter comes in, I would argue that experiencing Higurashi in its original format, in the version that's legally available on Steam, might be the most effective way to read Higurashi, to be immersed in the world of Higurashi. Because, ironically, or perhaps appropriately, its limited available means, the simpler conservative tools by which Ryukishi 07 was working when he composed his work and put all the assets together, exudes a pure authenticity that loses itself with each new, more polished re-release. And I will attempt to explain my feelings on the matter by opening a small parenthesis here. So, right on my Blue Sky account, I have been writing about Umineko no Naku Koroni, which is the spiritual successor to Higurashi. It's interesting to me that Umineko has a setting that in many ways it is similar to Higurashi in the sense that it is a seemingly small, isolated corner of the world with a much larger scale and scope behind it. And the more one reads, the more one lets itself be dragged along in that tumultuous journey, the larger the setting will become in an abstract sense, at the very least. But also, the island of Rokkenjima in Umineko is the complete and utter opposite to Higurashi in both presentation and in the way its existence is supposed to relate to your own lived-in experience. And I'm going to get into it by reading you a passage from my many Blue Sky posts. If you'll indulge my self-quoting, that is. This is what I had to write about the setting in Higurashi, as I was drawing a comparison with Umineko. The mountain town of Hinamizawa in Higurashi is a location right out of one's childhood nostalgia, an idyllic, picturesque image of the Japanese countryside that might no longer exist. A familiar yet distant place, a dream grounded in a relatable yearning for the simpler times, quote-unquote. Every environment and background were captured by a photographic camera and slightly blurred, thus making it all seem like a distant memory of the past. You could have lived in this town. You could have heard the cries of the cicadas during summer. You might have known of this place. Conversely, the island of Rokkenjima from Umineko, with its opulent Western-style mansion built on top of it, couldn't be farther from that feeling of familiarity. 'Tis the realm of the obscenely wealthy, right out of a mystery novel or a dark fable, far removed from everyday life. I have a lot more to say about the setting in Umineko, but this is not about Umineko, it's about, in fact, Higurashi. So let's go back on topic. It's fascinating to me how the backgrounds in the vanilla version of Higurashi really help you place yourself within the shoes of a main character, Keiichi, from his perspective, because those places were real. They didn't just feel real to you, they didn't just feel familiar to you. You could have feasibly seen that backyard, backwater countryside. You could have seen an illegal landfill where a construction site used to be. You could have seen an old building repurposed as a school building. You could have seen those places. You could have lived there. You could have remembered them. They feel real because they could have possibly existed at some point and you remember them. But also, these places literally did exist at some point because those are photographs. Photographs taken of actual real places that Ryukishio 7 could access to. This, for all intents and purposes, is a recreation of his own backyard, or at least something that is accessible to him, to his lived-in experience. These were pictures taken by not just him, actually, but also by members of his family. They captured a moment in time in the life of somebody that was then placed into a fantasy story, and they became the background, the literal and figurative background and backdrop for said fantasy that grounds it in reality. And the blur filter that crosses over them transmutates them into a version of that reality that feels distant, trapped in your memory of it. And I think this is something that future re-releases of Higurashi lose, because then all the backgrounds become professionally drawn, and they are beautiful backgrounds, mind you. They are an interpretation of those very real places, but they are no longer the real places, filtered through the distance of time and space. It's an extremely romantic and easily romanticized idea of what the Japanese countryside looks like. And it is also based in reality, the reality of what the Japanese countryside, or parts of it, might have looked like. But it could also be alive, because for all I know and understand, all those pictures might come from completely different sides of the country, and we are given the illusion that they represent one single location. And that is the beauty and also the alienating factor of reading Higurashi in its original state. The idea that something feels familiar, yet inevitably something feels off, and you are meant to question your own relationship and familiarity with it, with this place where the cicadas cry in the evening summer sun, and there is a landfill, and there are houses, and there is a unkempt road leading to the school building. This place is real, yet it isn't. It lives in your memory, it's a dream, yet it is grounded in the real world. It's beautiful and unpolished. It's beautiful because it's unpolished. It's grounded because it's real. It is scary because it's not quite like reality. And in that setting, within that particular vision of the Japanese countryside, that is where Higurashi is at its most effective as a psychological horror, because things always seem a bit off, and the sprites of the characters drawn on top of it only emphasize the strangeness. And those sprites are so good specifically because, much like the backgrounds, they aren't polished and they come from limited means, but they are gorgeous because they are so unique in the way that they are presented, in the way that they are placed atop those photographic blurred backgrounds. This adds to the horror, but also adds to that sense of familiarity that's eventually meant to be thrown off as the story slowly progresses and the mental sanity of point-of-view character Keiichi slowly erodes. And everything else that you experience through reading this first chapter is something that your own mind will fill in. You have the backgrounds, you have the royalty-free music, you have the occasional sound effect, you have the sprites, and you have the text scrolling on top of the screen. And everything else is added by your own imagination, by you filling the blanks, which is what makes reading such a fun activity. You advance at your own pace, you imagine things happening as they are described in your mind, and the addition of the sound element in this sound novel creates this unique atmosphere that's somewhere in between reading a book and your regular visual novel experience, which is usually a lot more asset-filled. To be perfectly honest, I don't think I've ever experienced literature in such a way. And honestly, I think I want more. Even though I know the story already, so I'm already fully spoiled, I want to re-experience it in this manner, to see exactly what was lost in translation when this story was adapted in all of its animated forms, because I know for a fact that as much as I like the original anime by Studio Dean, for which this recording is a companion piece, I know that it suffers from a lot of misguided or misaligned elements that were much stronger in the original text, and they were sort of glossed over in the anime, especially in that first season, which is very flawed and unpolished and was probably made on a small budget and with little time to work on it and make it the best that it could possibly be. And that is especially visible in the Shion arc, which I've already talked about briefly. I still maintain that Season 2 is fantabulous, and I love it, and it's almost as good as anything can ever be, as far as adaptations can go, but it still glosses over a couple of important elements that I'm sure were much better handled in the source material. And to emphasize that point, I want now to compare the cold opening for the anime to the cold opening in Chapter 1 of Higurashi. Technically, the same thing happens. Keiichi batters the girls to death. But whereas that scene is explicitly presented as it is in the anime, and it's about less than 30 seconds long, in the sound novel there is a lot more ambiguity, ambivalence, and a feeling of creeping terror as you read through it. Because what you don't get in the opening of the sound novel is an explicit murder scene. What you do get is an implication narrated from the feverish mind of what appears to be a serial killer. Because Keiichi's mind, in that particular moment, the way he's thinking, the way he is giving considerations to his victim at that point, feels like the lunatic rambling of a serial killer. The way he describes how much he liked her, he liked how she was demure and cute, he said he could have loved her, and while he's doing that, you can hear the sounds of a swing and a smash. A swing and a smash. A swing and a smash. And the only ambience that accompanies that scene, the perennial, omnipresent sound of the Higurashi as they cry. "10 out of 10 cold opening, incredible work. I understand just by those few minutes of the game before the title drop, I understand why fans of the sound novel don't like the anime. I get it. I still love the anime, but definitely something was lost in the transliteration of this text into the more actively audiovisual medium. And now I want to describe my favorite scene in the first chapter of Higurashi. And it's not any of the scenes, the most famous scenes that you might think of. It's not the lies scene. It's not the Rena is at the door scene. No, it's a moment that, to my knowledge, it has never been properly adapted into any other medium beside the sound novel or its many re-releases. Which is baffling because to me it is the most bone-chilling moment in the entire read. This is the scene that happens when Keiichi and Rena are walking to school for the very last time. After that, Keiichi becomes convinced that they are all out to get him, so he procures the baseball bat, which belonged to Satoshi, and then everything else slowly goes as wrong as it could possibly go. In this scene, Keiichi has become aware of what Rena's backstory was, or rather a portion of it, as he heard it from the goddamn cop, Detective Oishi. And really, when you think about it, all of this could have been easily avoided if he never talked to a cop. Rena and Old Man Mion say, "Don't talk to cops, kids." But regardless, in this scene, as he's standing in front of Rena and she's making her scary face, and her sprites is sitting there atop a completely black background and text is scrolling on top of her, you see the intrusive thoughts that Keiichi has been feeling sporadically truly taking over his mind as he pictures himself as one of the windows in Rena's old school, as she goes around smashing them with a baseball bat. And it's a scene punctuated not by creepy music, not by fanciful compositions or voice acting. It is a scene punctuated by the sound of a bat swinging, the smashing of windows, and once again, the Higurashi crying in the summer sun. That is peak psychological horror writing. It's hard to overstate how good Ryukishio 7 is at composing a scene of pure dread such as this one. And also props to the localization, because it's not half bad. I have a couple of doubts here and there about it, but overall it's very effective and it does its job very well. Yes, that is my favorite scene from Chapter 1, and if you take Chapter 1 of Higurashi as its own work, and you forget that there is an entire story coming after this that recontextualizes everything you thought you knew about this, if you take it as it is a wonderful depiction of a mind slowly eroding into madness consumed by anxiety and paranoia. And it's particularly effective because the story spent a long time, its first half of it, in fact, depicting how much fun it was to inhabit this world, this setting. Characters having fun, playing games, club activities, anime hijinks as far as the eye can see or read. It was a good time. It makes you yearn for a world where you can be so free to express yourself with your loved ones and your friends, and then to see all of that being slowly taken away as your fears and your own pre-existing psychological issues take over you. It's not only scary, it's heartbreaking. It's more so heartbreaking if you already know what the story is, what the score is. But it is so effective in being exactly what it is. This is an extremely well-composed, well-written horror story that eventually becomes a well-composed, moving story about friendship. And the journey to get us there is perhaps even more important than the destination, on account that you know what the destination already is, but you want to relive this journey because it is a journey worth experiencing many times. This is important fiction, in my opinion. That opinion has not changed. It is only being reinforced with my recent diving into this Higurashi media, and also the Umineko media. Umineko is a very important piece of fiction in its own right, I would say. Once again, if you want to read my thoughts on it, they are available on Blue Sky. If I am ever going to do an audio diary of sorts about Higurashi and perhaps going down the rabbit hole further and just read the entire fiction, this is probably the format I would choose. I will not make a 2 hours long video essay. I don't have the fortitude for that, not anymore, not ever. I sure hope I have done a good job to convey to you the experience of reading Higurashi in its original format, but like I said, all formats are valid for the most part. I think that the strength of the original text, even the parts that might have not aged the best inevitably because it's a story that was written 20 years ago or so, even that will shine through because it's a testament to the strength of the original work. It still can shine through with its themes and its characters even in lesser adaptations. The only parts of Higurashi that are garbage are the ones that have been made after the original story, because it was a popular franchise and it had to be milked for all it's worth, and inevitably, by doing so, we get to the point where the original meaning of Higurashi is lost, and the people who don't really understand what's good about Higurashi make a Higurashi show. My original point, and the point that I also made in the other video or podcast or however you want to call it, is that the original story of Higurashi, which begins and ends with its 8 chapters, which has been adapted into the anime in 2006 and 7. That is the Higurashi that's worth caring about. That is the Higurashi that I think it's important and timeless. Everything else made after it is either supplemental material that's completely optional or just downright terrible and unnecessary. I might have a couple of recommendations in terms of the supplemental material, but they would all be console exclusive arcs, so you would have to borrow them from your local library to experience them. I'm going to end this recording now and tell you that if you want to read Higurashi, if you are at least curious about chapter 1 of Higurashi, that is actually available for free on Steam. So you have no reason not to pick it up and see for yourself if it's your cup of tea. And as for me, well, I think I have more reading to do. No, seriously, Umineko is 5 million words long. I will not be done with it by next decade at this rate. And then I decided also to start reading the console exclusive chapters of Higurashi because I was curious about them, and some of them are very good, unexpectedly so, and now this is my life, I guess. Help me! Help me! Anyway, I am going to sign off. Thanks for listening, everybody, and remember, Oyashiro-sama is always watching. Always watching. Always.